где место исследований и данных реальной клинической практики.
So we'll speak, what is the place of the data of real practice research? First of all, I would like to say what concept we have, where is the place of standards, and how these documents are interrelated. At the end of 2018, we changed the main federal law, and in accordance with it, starting from 2024, medical care is to be affected on the basis of clinical recommendations. And the standards of medical aid that are one of the most important instruments for the calculation of costs. So they may not include technologies that are not registered on the territory of the Russian Federation. But off-label use of drugs can be in clinical recommendations. On the basis of these recommendations, we develop all the documents in accordance with the federal law, and they are part of the system of quality assurance of medical care. But very frequently, questions arise: who is responsible for what? And as to the clinical practice data, who is to initiate the actualization of documents? For the development and of clinical recommendations, the developer is responsible. They are also responsible for the actualization of the document within the required time. And of course, they see that the opinions of all interested parties are to be taken into account. The Healthcare Ministry of Russia is responsible for the setting the list of requirements for the development. And our center is responsible for the expert assessment and the preparation of expert conclusions. As to the and then the Healthcare Ministry considers the document. So speaking about the clinical recommendations from the point of view of data, our clinical recommendations are a combination of the research results and the experience of experts. That's why clinical recommendations may take into account only the data of the published research. If the trial was made, but the results haven't been published, this material is only an opinion of the expert. It cannot be included. Today, we have certain scales for the reliability of evidence. And here you see the scale of the levels of evidence reliability. And we may see that the real clinical practice trials may be a basis for making recommendations and forming clinical recommendations. Depending upon what trial was made, it can be included as a proof of the reliability of information, and depending on the design, it is assigned a level of evidence. Their second part is the assessment of the levels of recommendations. recommendations reliability. It is a strong recommendation, conditional recommendation, and weak recommendation, depending on the quality of the recommendation. The strong recommendation is when all the results are important. The second nuance, which we need to know, that clinical recommendations is an idealized picture, and we may say that if we take randomized clinical trials, they are done in ideal conditions, and clinical recommendations is a compilation of ideal conditions and real clinical practice. And unfortunately, there might be situations when clinical recommendations are very far from the real clinical practice and do not correspond to the patients that we meet in our life, or they cannot be realized in practice. So the real clinical practice and research could help here. They could help on the stage of planning and research to get more correct data. And on the stage of recommendations development, and what is very important, on the stage of introduction of clinical recommendations, because such studies could remove barriers of introduction. They could affect the process of the development of clinical recommendations and on the recommended process issues. On the other hand, they could have some scientific effect on what is recommended to do for the doctor in certain clinical situations. We need to note that we feel today that there is a certain advantage of real-world data and real-world evidence in respect to clinical practice, but there are some limitations. If we look at how the trials could help clinical recommendations, they could remove the gap between ideal picture and real efficacy. They could promote the development of personalized medicine. They could promote the introduction of clinical practice due to the continuous assessment, and they could support the measures on raising quality. On the other hand, there are certain nuances that require such things as confidentiality and cyber safety of data. So there are some limitations on the quantity and quality of data that can be collected and how it would cost. On the one hand, we have
менять систему и ее видоизменять, улучшать, там, увеличивать место исследования реальной клинической практики.
And in this case, of course, we can say that clinical recommendations should be changed. I know that there are questions about whether the RWE studies can replace clinical trials. And if we look at the scale that I showed you, like RWD, evidence level, of course, here the evidence level is lower than the level of clinical trials. Why not uplift RW data to the level of clinical trials? Well, it's not easy to do. And of course, RWD could help implement specific technologies, reduce the cost of trials, also have an impact on the safety of the use of medical technologies. On the other hand, the lack of unified standards in conducting such trials, in assessing the results of the study, in physical processing of data, and there are specific difficulties that we have here. Well, in this case, it's hard to fully stick to the methodology. And of course, in this case, RWDE cannot fully replace the clinical trial data. This replacement is simply impossible, at least as of today. Also, I'd like to draw attention to the fact that there might be a situation when, for example, we study RWD data and off-label drugs can be quite effective to treat a specific disease or condition. On the one hand, that's quite enough to include such drugs in clinical guidelines, because this could be good for practitioners. But on the other hand, we must realize that in the future, such data, although such drugs will be written into clinical recommendations, clinical guidelines, we cannot say that this will have a strong impact on the healthcare system per se. We cannot say that this will lead to the use of this off-label drug widely. This simply won't happen. Right now, in order to introduce specific large-scale changes, they must meet the regulatory requirements. If there is such RWD study, and for example, the dosing mode is not included in this RWDE trial, in this case, the use of such a drug will be limited. We need to meet the requirements of the legislation of the Russian Federation. Well, on the one hand, when we develop clinical guidelines, we take into account RWDE, and it depends on developers. They can include RWDE data into clinical trials and into clinical guidelines or not. On the other hand, well, RWD trials are quite important because they can improve clinical guidelines and they can bring ideal science, pure science, to real practice. And at the same time, RWD trials are lower on the pecking order compared to clinical trials. And of course, clinical guidelines have a lot of power if they are based on clinical trials, not on RWD. And of course, standards should be developed to conduct RWD trials in order to improve the status and importance of such trials. Thank you very much for your attention.